Well, hello, it's great to be with you today. My name's Kelly White. I'm the CEO and co-founder of RiskRecon, a provider of cybersecurity ratings and insights that make it easy to understand and act on your third-party and larger digital supply chain cybersecurity risks. Today, we're here to talk about the use cases for use of cybersecurity ratings and insights in programs. And to do that, we're joined by three people: Paul McKay, principal analyst at Forrester, where he covers the cybersecurity ratings space, among others. We also have Veronica Iles, consultant heading up their total economic impact studies. And most importantly, Marcia Peters from Transunion, vice president who heads up their global third-party risk management program. Our focus today is going to be on the use cases of cybersecurity ratings and insights. And we'll be talking in particular at first about the total economic impact study that Forrester conducted around the use cases and the value that organizations are getting from cybersecurity ratings in managing third-party risk. We'll then close out by pivoting over to Marcia Peters, where she'll be talking about her program and sharing her thoughts and insights on third-party risk management and how they've achieved significant scale and great results in their programs, leveraging, among other things, cybersecurity ratings. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. Paul McKay, thanks for joining me today.
Good to be with you.
Yeah, well, probably if you look at the world, there's very few people that think about cybersecurity ratings more than you do. So we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us. I've got a few questions for you. First of all, for our audience, why don't you take a moment to define the cybersecurity ratings space and what are the key characteristics of solutions in the market that people should be paying attention to?
Sure, no problem, Kelly. So I guess when we think about cybersecurity risk ratings platforms, I think the kind of very simple statement on them is that they're performing an external evaluation of a company's cybersecurity risk posture and also potentially that of its supply chain. So when we think about how we define a platform in terms of what features that it has, it's got a number of features and capabilities which support that basic aim and objective. So I think, first of all, I think the thing that differentiates it from approaches that have gone in this space before is that it actually allows the assessment in a continuous basis of a company and its entire supply chain by collecting, analyzing, and contextualizing different elements of security data that are externally observable that it can get a hold of. That can be anything from infrastructure that can be seen, protocols that are open on the internet from an organization, attributing assets to companies and so on and so forth, and many other different data points that ratings firms can get a hold of. And that needs to be specifically attributable back to an organization and also its subsidiary entities. So there's a capability there around collecting that information, parsing it, making sure that you're correctly attributing information and pulling that together into some kind of algorithm that correctly enumerates those things and combines them into a clear and open way of understanding how those different risk factors come together to give you an overall assessment of the potential risk that company faces or that a supply chain member of that company poses to that organization from a footprint. So that hints at the need for a consistent and clear methodology, and also vitally for the building of trust with users who are being rated themselves and also by companies using the rating. That methodology needs to be public so that people can understand what are the different data points that are being collected, how they're being combined together, and how some of the different factors are being weighted to achieve the final result. What's also important is that where there are inaccuracies within that rating or a company disputes some of the results, there needs to be a publicly available dispute resolution process with the ratings platform provider that enables them to correct in a fairly easy and transparent way any potential inconsistencies. Clearly, we'll also want to see that being used in a number of different use cases. Now, there are lots of different use cases that this market and the data that it has can support, but the two most common that we see are evaluating your own enterprise risk, so looking at how you're viewed by people on the outside and what things that people can see about you, and also to help you understand some of the risk posture within some of your sub-entities, particularly applicable if you're a very global and complicated organization. And finally, third-party risk, which we'll obviously come on to a lot later. And I think the final thing that's critically important here is that there's a lot of data that gets generated by these platforms, and people tend to focus on that. But it's also absolutely critical to make sure that that data is usable. So we do put a big importance on the importance of integration with related risk management technologies. And examples of that might include GRC platforms and third-party risk platforms. They're not the only ones, but they're probably the main ones that we see people looking to integrate with. So that, in a nutshell, is how we define the market here at Forrester and the kind of things that we look for from participants in this space.
In a sentence or two, or briefly, how would you describe the value proposition of cybersecurity ratings and related insights?
Sure. I think the way that I would articulate this is by using the third-party risk example. So I guess the value that you get from that is you can continuously monitor your most critical third parties and save a lot of time in terms of understanding what risk they pose to you by using the data within the platform, and also validate whether they're telling you an accurate picture in their third-party questionnaire submissions as to whether you're doing a good job or not. Very frequently, we find that the grass is green and the flowers are rosy. And when you see some of the data from these platforms, that usually paints a different story. So if I could illustrate it by way of example, I think that's really a kind of key example that we see given again and again by my clients as to where they've seen value from the platform. And you'll see that later on in the TAI study when the results are presented.
Right. Yeah, these are you take third-party risk management, and that's a pretty big that's a pretty big space. Do you have a couple of 2 or 3 example use cases that might be subsets of that you'd like to just highlight briefly before we talk with Veronica in detail?
Sure. So I think the key things that I would kind of pick out within the third-party risk space that we see people using these solutions for are when you're acquiring a new vendor. Say, for example, the business comes to you and says, hey, we want to do business with this entity. Now, one of the standard things that we would obviously always look at is what's the security posture of that entity, what kind of data we expect to be transferring over to it, and what kind of criticality does it have to our organization. So that kind of pre-vendor acquisition due diligence piece, these solutions are often used as a part of that to try and drive down some of the efficiency so that we can get to an answer of, yes, it's safe to do business with this organization, or actually there are a few things that we need them to tighten up on before we go ahead with the relationship. That kind of due diligence element before a relationship happens is important. But then probably most importantly, and this is where I think the risk ratings solutions come into their own, is once you're actually in the relationship, you can keep a continuous eye on some of your more critical third parties during the relationship. And that bit is probably the bit that we see most people not focusing on enough in our kind of experience working with folks in third party risk management programs.
I suppose the big question that kind of looms out there is the traditional approach for managing third party risk has been questionnaires. So maybe when you're onboarding a new vendor or considering a new vendor, you might send a questionnaire, and then periodically over time, as you maintain that relationship, you'd be
exactly.
So in your mind, are these mutually exclusive, or do they work together? And what roles do you see each of them playing?
So I think these approaches complement each other, because I think there are clearly elements of a traditional questionnaire. You think about questions like physical security, for example. That's kind of hard to automate away. You still need to have some understanding of how people are building the physical security of a site, for example, that your data is going to be stored at. That still needs to be handled via questionnaire and through traditional approaches. But where we find these solutions really come into their own and help complement the questionnaire-based approaches is where you can take some of the technical data, take an area like patching, for example. The questionnaire submission of an organization will say, yes, of course we patch, and yes, of course we apply all of the Microsoft patches when Patch Tuesday comes around, and we do it all on time, and there are never any problems, which Marcia will probably laugh at from her experience. What you then tend to find is when you use some of these continuous monitoring solutions at which the cyber risk ratings platforms provide, you can actually see pretty quickly in real time whether the assertions that the vendor is making are actually borne out by what we see in the data in reality. And those kind of nuggets, I think, are really where these solutions come into their own.
Okay. There's a number of competitors in the market, RiskRecon being one of them. And, and so as you look at the space and the competitors, do you observe some patterns of different approaches that different solutions are falling into? And if so, what are those?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. So I think there are firms that focus very much on the production and dissemination of the ratings themselves, and they put a lot of emphasis on that. So that would include people like yourselves and some of your other kind of more established competitors. But at the same time, we see some other firms that have maybe come to this through more of a third-party management angle. So they've got a third-party product that they have themselves, and they've added ratings on as an additional capability. Okay. So that's one thing that they do. And then I guess the other approach, which is an approach taken by some of the other firms, is they're starting to maybe try and layer in some of the quantification aspects of cyber risk. Now, they haven't fully managed that, but it's something that we see some firms starting to do.
Okay.
And then you get into analogous spaces. For example, we take the example of the attack surface management platform, where the technical question that's being asked is actually very different, and people are looking to build up how should we say, technical enumeration of the entire digital footprint of an organization or a company. Mm-hmm. You see some of those providers being pressurized into adding a rating component to their overall solution. And I think to some extent that is an interesting one, because I don't think that those solutions necessarily talk to the same type of buyers that you see in the core risk ratings platform space, where we're much more in the risk and third-party management space, so at a much more senior level within the organization, whereas those attack surface management tools tend to be driven more towards the need of a security operations center. Now, you see in practice that both solutions can address some of the requirements of both different types of buyers, but there are different ways of skinning the cat. And I guess from my perspective, as long as the client outcomes are achieved, it kind of doesn't matter which approach you take. All approaches have some validity in and of themselves.
Right. Okay. Well, one last question: how do you see this space evolving in the next 1 to 2 years? What do you expect to happen? What should we be aware of?
Okay, so I think in terms of how the space is going to evolve in the next 1 to 2 years, I think one of the things that we're going to see in this space is that we're going to see a greater usage and linkage of the data that's collected by solutions in this space with cyber risk quantification mechanisms. So I'm expecting that we haven't really gotten over the potential of the data sets we're collecting here, and I think a lot of that data can actually help to influence some of the risk quantification work that's being thought of as a way to try and change the way in which we articulate cyber risk to the board. So my expectation is that a lot of the providers in this space will move in that direction to try and start linking the data they have to help firms in quantifying their risk in financial terms as well as non-financial terms. So that's one thing. I think the second thing that we're going to start to see is I think we're going to start to see a lot more standardization in the level of public disclosure and potentially independent verification of the ratings methodologies that are used by firms in this space. So at the moment, there's some variance in how open or not different providers are in the market around that. So we expect that to kind of standardize. And again, we might see some more drive towards updating maybe some of the fair and accurate principles which were published in this space a couple of years ago to try and achieve that kind of more open book approach to doing this stuff. So that would probably be the two main changes for me that I could think of in the next 1 to 2 years. Of course, there's some other stuff that would maybe out on a longer time horizon.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Paul, thank you. And also thank you for your work on this total economic impact study that Forrester conducted in talking with RiskRecon customers to discover use cases and value that they're getting. And so with that, Veronica, we'll kick over to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. So, screen share. Thanks, Kelly. That's quite the act to follow. Paul had some really great answers, and a lot of what he talked about will actually be quantified or talked about in my presentation. So firstly, my name is Veronica Iles. I am a consultant here at Forrester in our total economic impact practice. And I had the pleasure of sharing with you the results of the program impact study that was commissioned by RiskRecon. So we're going to start with talking about what is a TEI, and then I'll walk through a few pieces of the customer journey. And then we're going to get into the meat of this session, which is the return on investment calculation and the business case benefits. So the total economic impact, or TEI methodology, is one that Forrester has been using to help our clients for nearly 20 years. And we do this because in one of our many surveys, Forrester loves their surveys, we found that over 90% of decision makers say that it's important for them to have a next level business case. And this is one that makes an economic justification for an investment. And what's really unique about the TEI is that we speak with several customers of the technology provider who've experienced a real measurable impact as a result of their investment. And then we use those stories and those data points as a basis for our findings. So for the RiskRecon study, we interviewed 6 customers who'd been using RiskRecon for 6 months to several years. And we spoke to cyber risk leaders across a range of industries and sizes and use cases. And in order to set a baseline, I always ask interviewees to describe their prior environments. So what was life like before the RiskRecon investment? And in that prior environment, there were several challenges that were shared by these customers. First, the risk teams conducted annual assessments and questionnaires, and they were able to send them no more than once a year, and sometimes even less frequently. So any insights from this approach were outdated immediately and left months of activity unmonitored between those questionnaires. The third-party risk management programs were limited in size. There were usually only a handful of staff to manage increasingly large third-party programs. And the prior environment was highly manual. This meant that teams were relying on Excel or spreadsheets to track questionnaires and assessments and to conduct analysis. And then there was one organization that had a legacy continuous monitoring tool that was already in place. And they found that it was difficult to use that data to fix issues with their third parties. And there was only a limited visibility into what factors contributed to a drop in score. And then finally, the risk assessment approach was inherently flawed because it provided only a point-in-time view and was answered by a third-party representative who might answer incorrectly. And those answers couldn't be validated. I love what Paul said a few minutes ago. He said that the grass is green, the flowers are rosy when you have assessments and questionnaires in this form. So then I asked customers, what were the objectives of an investment what were the objectives of the RiskRecon investment? And what I heard is that they hoped to impactfully lower the operational risk across the business using RiskRecon's insights. They hope to improve the visibility into third-party risk hygiene more frequently than just that once a year. They wanted to compare their scores to competitors and to industry averages. And then arm executives with friendly visualizations to inform better decision-making. And then finally, use RiskRecon to measure and monitor KPIs to really help them demonstrate the positive impact of their third-party risk program. So based on these interviews, we took the experiences and the stories of these customers, and we created a composite organization that is representative of all of the interviewees and their common experiences while remaining completely anonymous. So our composite organization is headquartered in the US with revenues ranging from 2 to 10 billion. There are approximately 2,000 employees, 7,000 third parties, and 1,200 of those third parties are considered to be high risk. The third-party risk management team is made up of 3 full-time resources who previously ran a spreadsheet-based assessment risk program. And while the interviewees used RiskRecon in varied and many ways, the Composite Institution has 5 use cases. It uses RiskRecon in its new vendor selection and procurement process for prioritizing vendors with the highest inherent risk, to target questions, validate answers, and for working with third parties to remediate the problems that RiskRecon identifies. It uses RiskRecon for continuous monitoring of vendor risk postures and to respond proactively to vulnerabilities. It uses RiskRecon for monitoring the business's own score, which is called the Own Enterprise score, to improve the externally facing risk hygiene and to remove shadow IT. And then finally, our composite organization uses RiskRecon to benchmark against competitors and industry standards. So, based on our analysis, we determined that our composite institution experienced a 3-year return on investment of 147%, benefits of $2.4 million, and a net present value of $1.4 million. So what does that mean? Well, all of the numbers that I'm going to share with you are in their present value, meaning that they have been adjusted to reflect that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Net present value, or NPV, is simply the total benefit minus the total cost. And I'm going to share a quote here. So the partner of strategic risk shared with us that the bottom line justification for RiskRecon is it improves your risk governance, it improves your cyber risk assessment, and therefore improves your ability to do better risk governance. I'm sure you're saying, wow, where did we come up with those figures from? Well, it was through quantifying 4 key benefits that the customers described, and then we quantified them for our composite organization. The first of those benefits is the productivity lift associated with the ongoing understanding, acting, and resolving of cybersecurity issues. Then we have savings from routine third-party assessment efficiencies and savings from avoided third-party audits. And then lastly, M&A-related productivity lift. And I just want you to know, within the actual study itself, we break down the calculations for each benefit into a financial framework that is transparent and hopefully very easy to understand. And it shows what line items are calculations, which characteristics are from our composite organization, and the inputs from the interviews themselves. And the hope is that you can get your hands on a copy of this study and use the frameworks that we've developed to create your own business case analysis for RiskRecon. And in the meantime, I'm going to give you an overview of those 4 benefits. So first and foremost, the most significant business outcome shared by customers was the ability for the existing third-party risk teams to do much more without adding additional headcount. And our composite organization measured its success in several ways. It avoided hiring 4.5 additional third-party risk management resources. It improved its own score by 62% and increased the overall score of the third-party ecosystem by 30%. I also heard that customers were able to resolve 70% of identified issues within 1 year. And the Director of Information Security really says it best. When we started with RiskRecon, our score was in the mid-5s. We worked hard to improve that, and now we're around mid-9s. It has given us a good track record of what to improve. For our second benefit, this quantifies the efficiencies gained by the third-party risk management team around conducting annual assessments. RiskRecon does not replace an organization's need to conduct annual questionnaires and surveys, and Paul mentioned that a few minutes ago. But it does help prioritize vendors with the highest known risk and enables the team to target specific areas of concern. So for our composite organization, they evaluate 100 new vendors each year and then have 2 tiers of medium and high risk vendors that each get assessed of varying degrees. And the productivity lift for the team for this task is 56%, or nearly 13,000 hours saved over the course of 3 years. And that 3-year present value of this benefit is $591,000. Our third benefit focuses on the savings realized by customers when leveraging RiskRecon data as part of their audit plans to determine which vendors to evaluate based on that risk scoring mechanism. So for every vendor determined to not need a formal audit, the composite saves $7,500. And over 3 years, the organization brings down their audited group from 10% of their high-risk vendors down to 3%. So over the course of 3 years, that totals about $631,000 in savings. And for our final quantified benefit, this is also something that Paul mentioned, using RiskRecon as part of this M&A due diligence. But what we found is that customers who use RiskRecon to assist with their M&A efforts found that they were able to reduce some of that manual labor by approximately 80 hours for each acquisition. We calculated for our composite organization 2 M&A targets evaluated annually, and for each of those years, it's about $11,000 of savings. But other measurements that could be considered as part of this business case might be the avoided capital spending that would have been needed to solve technology problems post-integration, or the insights to demand tail coverage to protect against cyber liabilities post-acquisition. And then finally, the potential negotiation power for more favorable contractual terms. So the 4 benefit categories I just walked you through are incredibly important to demonstrate the value of RiskRecon and for building a business case for RiskRecon. But the customers I interviewed also shared stories of success that were not quantified for this study. Customers told me about how senior leadership is using RiskRecon to better understand cybersecurity risk and are using that data to make more informed decisions. RiskRecon was also used to proactively respond to incidences recently like SolarWinds. Customers also reduced shadow IT risks, and that drove some marginal savings from consolidation. And finally, for those customers that had conducted a buy versus build analysis, they found that using RiskRecon over a homegrown solution was a more cost-effective option. So I hope you enjoyed this little teaser. Now go out and read the full study and build your own business case for RiskRecon. I will leave you with one last quote from the VP of Cyber Risk, who said, "Continuous monitoring is a lot easier to implement than you might think. It's actually very simple to put in place. This program pays dividends, and RiskRecon gives you access to the back-end data for in-depth investigations, so you can double and triple check what you've seen in the tool and be able to really provide very targeted and detailed information related to a potential incident. Anybody can put a third-party continuous monitoring program in place very easily with minimum investment and pay off potentially huge returns." And for our composite organization, again, over the course of 3 years, there was a return on investment of 147%, benefits of $2.4 million, a net present value of $1.4 million, and a payback in about under 6 months. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and back to you, Kelly.
Well, thank you, Veronica. It's great to thank you, Veronica. There's a lot of good things happening in companies successfully managing third-party cybersecurity risk, and it's great to get these stories out. So thank you for that. Forrester's an objective observer and analyst of the industry, and your insights and the stories you share are very valuable and hold a lot of weight. So Marcia, thank you for taking some time today to share your expertise and insights with people attending this webinar. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
So I've been watching Transunion for a long time, before you were a customer of RiskRecon. And my observation is that Transunion's been a pioneer in managing third-party cybersecurity risk, and is set a lot of the patterns that now a number of companies are seeking to follow. Least of those is the application of cybersecurity ratings and just objective insights to do this better and at a greater scale. So, Transunion, one of the things that stands out around what I just said was that Transunion is really operating a very large scale, and I'll say it's beyond third-party risk, isn't it? It gets into partners and so on. What's the business driver for operating, I'll call it a digital supply chain risk program, at such a large scale, when so many organizations really kind of whittle it down to just, hey, well, here's a few companies and we'll monitor and assess them, but everyone else will just kind of ignore. What's the case for having an expansive governance and situational awareness capability over your digital supply chain?
I think one of the challenges that we have at Transunion and all industries is understanding how our business partners connect to us. And as we discovered, how that they're connecting to us in a variety of different ways, we wanted to make sure that we could monitor those partners. So, we have a number of different kinds of partners. Some partners we might build into the back end of our systems. Some partners may build us into the back end of their systems. Others may just, use our data. And we want to address a number of different kinds of risks. First one is data protection, no matter, who has our data. It might be protect against loss. It might be protect against misuse. We also want to protect ourselves against security incident that propagates from a partner might propagate from our partner into our network. And I think that one became a lot more important. It's always important, but it was a lot more urgent because of COVID. There were a lot more smaller companies being compromised, and we wanted to make sure that something that happened at one of our partners didn't make its way into our network. And so that's one of the reasons we're looking at those partners that are probably more fall in our customer risk program than what we would call our supplier risk program.
One of the things that's top of mind for people is ransomware. And while a partner might not have data exposure with a partner, you might have ability to operate exposure with a partner due to ransomware. Has that changed the scope of the companies that you're paying attention to?
No, I think that was there from the outset.
Okay.
That falls into the under the heading of we don't want a security incident at a third party to make its way into our environment. And there were a number of partners that had an issue last year when we really saw ransomware starting to ramp up a lot, and we had to deal with finding out from RiskRecon that there's something that happened. Lots of times we find out that something happened in the news, and then we use RiskRecon to do some research, see what their exposure, that company, are they in our portfolio? Do we, what are we seeing from a monitoring standpoint? Were they vulnerable in a way that that would impact us?
Yeah. Well, a lot of companies take a very limited view into what parts of their digital supply chain they're going to pay attention to and govern and maintain situational awareness of. I think they're reconsidering that, given the nature of the events that are occurring. Transunion being a pioneer in the space, you already anticipated this, so you're well prepared. What are some of the essential capabilities you'd highlight in your program that enable you to operate at such a large scale very efficiently?
So we some of the capabilities that we use it was really great to see the materials that Veronica showed and hear what Paul had to say, because I'm like, oh yeah, we do that. So we use it in that initial assessment. We get ready to do an assessment. We pull a quick score, see what we're kind of looking at, right? If they've got a great score, then we can feel pretty hopeful about the assessment. If they've got a terrible score, then we know we need to take a really, really close look.
Yeah.
But then we use that continuous monitoring feature, right? Our assessment that we do is a point in time, and it's too expensive to do one of those every month, right? So we just monitor our have our alerts set up to tell us if something that RiskRecon has found is concerning to us, and we get our alerts set up.
Yeah.
And we use it for the M&A use case as well that Veronica outlined, and also then our first party, like our own security. How do we look in the to people who are using RiskRecon for their security programs, and then our monitoring of our peers as well to see how we benchmark across our industry.
Yeah, good. Well, I've always observed that your team has got the right set of capabilities, very analytical mindset, very data oriented, and it seems like solving cybersecurity risk has always involved data has been a very important part of that, and rapidly collecting and analyzing and then just making those decisions is important, and your team's really, really good at that. And I certainly recognize that RiskRecon is just a part of a much larger program that you've built other data sources and capabilities around to manage such a complex global system. Are there any particular, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, are there any tangible victories that you're just really proud of that your team's been able to achieve that you'd like to highlight?
It's one that we're just starting to do, but the part where I can set up my portfolio, in different groupings and say, so here's my tier one, or my highest risk, my very high risk, third parties, and here's my high risk for third parties. And then to be able to start aggregating, get an overall aggregate score for that, tranche of third parties, and being able to, it's the very first steps at being able to say, this is how, we've aggregated the risk of using a third party across TransUnion's portfolio. And that's going to be a huge victory for us. We're getting really close on that.
Yeah, cool. So last question here, and I suppose this is one that's rooted in just the events that organizations are facing, where I think mid-December, the disclosure of the SolarWinds breach really awakened a lot of people to the reality that so much of an organization's risk lies outside of its own systems and networks and is embedded within a very vast, interconnected digital supply chain. And then you have follow-on events that keep on rolling, like CodeCov, where they just, criminals are able to compromise and modify a single line of code, and then you've got data being stolen from a whole bunch of different software publishers. And then, of course, you get the common news like Colonial Pipeline. It's like, oh my gosh, like the sky is falling. It just seemed like there's been more and more bad news every day. So my question to you is this: are you optimistic that organizations will be able to successfully solve this pressing digital supply chain threat? Or are you pessimistic? And why? Why are you optimistic, or why are you pessimistic? Which one?
So I always choose optimism.
Okay.
but it's
that can be a character flaw, I'm just kidding.
It could be. But I think that it is optimism in the long term. I think that the events that we've seen here in the last several months are really raising awareness and in a way that we didn't, that we just hadn't anticipated that we would, that we were vulnerable, right? The SolarWinds thing, I think really was a wake up call about how one line of code gets deployed in somebody's feature, in somebody's, is a feature update or just like a new version of the code, right? And there it is. And I don't think we still know where we're going to see impact from that, right? Because that was so widely distributed. But I think that, because of the coverage that we got in the news, that we're raising a lot of awareness on that. I think that we've seen a couple of letters out of the current administration that are, raising awareness about our responsibilities as companies in terms of, cybersecurity. And so I think those are all good things, but, for the nuts and bolts for me, I think that means that we've got to be extra vigilant on all fronts of cybersecurity as we're doing our third-party assessments, right? I think that we've seen a lot of change in the last years around network security, and everyone's very aware of that and concerned about that. And they know they need to do pen tests, and they know that they need to do, vuln scans and patching and things like that. But they don't always put a lot of, one of the things that, I see more often as a concern is that security is not built into their software development lifecycle. And until we get that piece fixed up, I think we're going to continue to see, what we've been seeing in this last year.
So long-term optimistic, but lots of work to do.
Yes.
Yeah. I've always been a big fan of third-party risk management and an advocate of it, because it is the mechanism by which organizations can hold each other accountable to doing well. And in that customer-vendor relationship, you have economic leverage that you can use to make those good things happen. And I think it's played a critical role. The work your team does, I'm certain, and I know that it has raised the bar of cybersecurity to a higher standard for your vendors than it would without it. And that the work of others in the practice of third-party cybersecurity risk management is, again, it is one of the primary drivers for raising the bar. And it makes just everything better. For the first time, going back to your comment about regulations, being a former CISO myself, CISOs and organizations are actually, a lot of them are fans of the regulations and the directives that are coming out. That hasn't always been the case. And I think that's, as you say, that's as you speak about that in a positive tone, I think that's broadly being recognized as, yes, we need this now. Whereas regulation may have been something that people didn't want in the past, but yeah, I expect good things to come as well. So lots of hard work to do as always, but reasons to be optimistic. Well, thank you all. Paul, Veronica, Marcia, always great to talk with you. Really grateful for the work that you are doing and the work you've done to share the use cases for cybersecurity ratings and the related insights that can be used in organizations, large and small across the world, to improve digital supply chain security. Please do visit the RiskRecon site to download the study conducted by Forrester and understand the value proposition there. Thank you again, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Kelly.